Well, look, it's always a pleasure to have Caiyuda Kiora in my vicinity to have conversations. It's been a while, brother, since we've really kind of dropped in together for any more than a few minutes at a time. So, firstly, kind of welcome back to the Fifth Direction space, to the Fifth Direction community.
Thanks, mate. It has been a while. And like I mentioned to you, it's good to be back in your field, mate, and to have you on the periphery for quite some time now and then coming back into attention and awareness. So, yeah, thanks for having me, mate. And it's a pleasure to reconnect.
Man, I kind of wanted to just begin by asking you, and you kind of answered it a little bit to say, geographically, where are you? So we can, people listening can kind of orientate themselves. And I wanted to also ask that question from a more kind of sacred point of view, kind of what's alive in your heart? Where are you? So maybe you can speak to both of those.
Geographically, well, we've recently relocated out to the Central Highlands, a little bit north of Ballarat in Victoria. And we've been here for about 4 months now. And I think I mentioned this to you last time. We just had a brief tune in. Being out here, it's made me realize how much I miss the Victorian high country when we're essentially at the base of Mount Buller, Mount Sterling, just at the foothills of the Vic Alps on the outskirts of Mansfield. I mean, I grew up down by the coast, I think, as you well know, the coast, the surf coast of Victoria. But despite growing up by the ocean, I have long felt like a mountain man at heart and soul. So the mountains are really what draw me forth. And I mean, geographically, looking in from a bit of a different perspective, well, within the context of my life, well, one way to say it is that for some years now, I've been, some people might call me a technician in the shamanic healing arts. I'm a wilderness trekking guide, a nature connection mentor, holistic health coach, shamanic ceremonialist, sacred sound musician, a bit of an unconventional mystic, father to two young daughters, a mountain man. And look, we could keep going on and on from there. But before I get too sidetracked, I'll let you jump back in.
Yeah. So, and I guess this kind of bleeds into one of the areas that I know that you're kind of passionate about, which is this understanding of the convergence of, I guess, spirituality and shamanism and especially like nature connection skills.
Yeah. So perhaps one place to start to kind of contextualize or pre-contextualize all of it is I recently had a comedian, Nick Sun, on my podcast, and he mentioned or phrased this term, the Great Deception. And I think like the Great Disconnection, I think it's a good place to kind of use as a springboard to then jump off into why I feel like it's important to expose ourselves to these nature-based initiatory experiences and returning to some sort of wilderness or wild consciousness and the shamanic practice and philosophy, all that kind of stuff. So if you feel like that might be a good place to kind of springboard, I'll just riff and see where my brain takes me.
Please go ahead.
Okay. Well, I would say that we live in a time where there are quite clearly many cosmologies, perspectives, beliefs, you could even say narratives, agendas, distractions. And from my experience, there are certainly energies out there that keep people tethered to states of fear, anxiety, disempowerment, the energy harvesting, the energy farming, the distractions, all these types of things. And, some people might talk about it in terms of the Great Deception. And then what do we actually mean by the Great Deception? Where's it coming from? Well, I might say that it's coming from perhaps certain people, organizations, institutions, authoritative governments, secret societies, the way that this socio-cultural climate of ours has perhaps also naturally kind of evolved to, these sorts of things. But I've also certainly noticed a suppression, you could even say a demonization of certain nature-based traditions. You may even say cultures at whole, practices such as, let's say, paganism, shamanism, the use of sacred plants and herbs to facilitate healing and an expansion of this awakening process. And this has been going on for a long, long time. So there's all those factors, but then I also think about we can't discount like a larger kind of a metaphysical force that might have its own kind of separate autonomy outside of the human body mind soul complex and the human to human interracial fields. And I feel like my brain's going here because I've been consuming, reading a bit of this content lately, but we could talk about forces such as, there's lots of ways to articulate Satan, Hasatan, the idea of Wendigos or Watikos, which has been well known by Paul Levy in his book. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. Kind of Aubrey Marcus on his podcast has been making this quite well known as well. But Paul Levy's got his book Dispelling Watikos. And, it's a force that tries to suck us into a reality of disconnect. You could even delusion. You could even say malevolence, really, But, I can feel my brain starting to go into this idea of egregores, which is a collective thought form or entity that is created and strengthened through our shared cosmologies, beliefs, emotions, actions. So much so that an egregore really takes on a life of its own. From a Hindu or a Buddhist philosophy, there's the concept of Maya. Maya refers to the illusion of the material world and the importance of seeing the deception of this to understand or to get closer to the true nature of reality or divinity, from my understanding. Like Gnosticism speaks about it in a similar way, about the demiurge in relation to the material world being one of deception, and that you might say true knowledge or gnosis involves seeing through the deception to understand the divine realm. So, from if one has their lens attuned to like the energetic centers in the body, there's a split here. Luciferic being obsessed with the higher spiritual realms without being connected to the lower, and vice versa. Aromatic beings being obsessed with the lower chakras, the desire for power, sexual desire, basic survival instincts, while negating the spiritual realms. And of course, there's a middle way, the integration of both, yin, yang, seeking harmony, like seeking to bridge worlds that connect us to the physical manifest reality and also the higher spiritual planes of existence, and finding a way to walk in respect and wisdom and integrity. So, in saying all of that, yeah, there's a lot of forces out there. You could keep talking about it in terms of lots of different archetypes, lots of different ways that try to keep us disconnected. Yeah, amnesia runs deep. However, you could say the pendulum is certainly swinging. The great turning, the great awakening, the great revealing, there's this rapid expansion of consciousness, and it does indeed seem to be happening from my point of view. So the way that I usually language it is that there's an invitation here, at least in the context of my work, which is to connect back to the wisdom of nature, to keep exploring the mysteries, to keep exploring truth, to awaken more of our potential, to reclaim more of our own personal power, to activate our soul path, or you might say our soul gifts or our medicines that we have to offer loved ones and community. And then this kind of leads us to the idea of understanding this convergence of the nature awareness skills, the spirituality, mysticism, shamanism, these sorts of things.
Mm.
That was a big kind of
No, man,
riff there.
I enjoyed listening. And I'm also, immediately taken to the idea that, Lucifer means man of light, and
Yep.
we are talking about an angel here who,
Yeah.
kind of was expelled from the heavenly plane for refusing to worship humans above God,
Mm.
which
Mm.
was God's request of him. He said, "No, you're the one. You're my true beloved. I can't put anything above you."
Mm. Mm.
And down he was sent. So, I guess what I'm saying is, to me, that points a little bit to that middle way to kind of reframing your understanding of these things.
Mm.
And this idea that you talk about, this idea of bridging, it feels to me that that's kind of the work that you're offering.
Mm.
Taking people out into nature, pilgrimage, and through all the various modalities that you have
Mm.
is really an exercise in bridging.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, it is. I mean, lately, um, to offer like a bit of this framework of how it kind of all comes together, I often use a triangle. I'll draw a triangle, and if you can try and visualize it, at each point of the triangle, we'll find on one point there's nature awareness skills. On another point, there's shamanism and animism. And then on the other point, there's spirituality and mysticism. And then if we draw another little triangle inside that one, the smaller three sections, they represent connection, community, culture. And then that central point, well, you might be able to guess what that is. It's the self. It's us. And then kind of radiating out from all this, it's this idea of heart-centered and soul-oriented consciousness that I talk about, and this idea of new earth leadership. And, to some people that might sound a little bit woo or a little bit kind of strange or cliche or corny or something like this. But, I feel that contextualizing everything is so important. And it takes a while, like in this fast food digital culture that we were speaking to, oftentimes we miss out on a lot of the subtlety, the nuance, the context for things. And we're relegated to the realms of kind of shallow or, the superficiality. So it takes time to kind of build context to understand the importance of these things.
No, that makes sense. And when you're talking about self there in the middle of your triangle, are you talking about, deep self, which Jung would also call soul, or is it some other definition in your way of thinking?
Well, you could certainly consider that to be a part of it, although, that might also fall. It's all blends. I mean, it's we like to think that these maps and models are kind of defined in one way or another, but they're so malleable and kind of that's the thing. The map's just a map. It's not the territory itself.
Mm.
But no, when we're talking about these ideas of spirit and soul, I would say that kind of falls into that point on the triangle when we're talking about spirituality and mysticism. So, if I was to deconstruct it a little bit more to provide that context, you could say, well, the spirituality that involves a sense of connection to something much greater than our sense of self, the interconnectedness of all of life. Mysticism, well, that's speaking to the insights, the wisdom of having direct experiences with the divine, with truth, with creator, with spirit. And, as I mentioned, the idea of not just the idea, but the lived reality of spirituality and mysticism. It involves conversations around the nature of soul and spirit. Shamanism. Geez, there's a lot that we could say here, mate, which I'm sure you're well aware of. And maybe we can expand upon it later if the conversation goes there. But with shamans, we're talking about bridging worlds, as you spoke to, between this world and the other. That includes repeatable, consistent techniques for altering and expanding consciousness, extrasensory modes of perception, developing personal power and learning to master one's energy, these sorts of things. And then there's the underlying foundation of shamanism, which is animism. You can't have shamanism without animism, which is really the lived perception that the world is alive and full of spirits. All elements of nature have a spiritual essence. And then, of course, there's the nature awareness or the nature connection piece too. And I've got a lot to say around that too. But, because it might sound strange when we talk about the idea of nature connection. It might seem like, well, that's an obvious thing, isn't it? I mean, we're always connected to nature in one way or another, right? Intrinsically, we're nature.
Well,
But
yeah, that's my point. I often stumble in my mind over the whole idea of connecting to nature. Like, how can I connect to something that I already am? There's
yeah.
kind of a weird paradigm. Something's in there which makes my mind kind of glitch.
Well, yeah, exactly. We are nature, but for a lot of people, I would say that that's more of a conceptual idea or a bit more of a surface level kind of, understanding or embodiment rather than a fully lived and breathed connection on a
Mm,
daily basis.
yeah, and is that why you make the distinction between, um, nature connection and kind of nature awareness skills in terms of that second one being something
Yeah.
more, yes, the connection is innate. So
Mm.
let's learn some skills about recognizing that on a more moment to moment basis.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's important to make some or create some distinctions and around that phrasing. So, when we're talking about nature connection, for some people that might be, well, the inherent nature of being nature, but on the external it might be growing foods and herbs or spending time gardening or enjoying birds in the backyard, walking barefoot in nature, walking through the local park. Could be bushwalking, camping, fishing, outdoor adventure, these sorts of things. Like, you kind of get the point in that side of the realms of nature connection. But, if we want to add different layers to it, this is where we might get into this idea of the shortcomings of the modern ideas of nature connection. And we could say that a way to develop a more sincere intimacy, or you could even say an antidote if you even want to take it that far. Like we start talking about nature awareness skills. And, in regards to some of the shortcomings, well, we kind of have to be honest with ourselves in our inquiry and our reflections when it comes to how deeply connected are we really to nature. I mean, how well do we really know the changing of the seasons in our area? Who are the birds that are around at this time of the year or at any time of the year? What are their calls? What are they saying? Where do they nest? What kind of plants are in our area and what are their qualities and characteristics? What's the relationship between the certain birds and certain plants? What's our connection or our relationship to the spirits of the land? Like, where do we find ourselves, and where and how do we orient ourselves within the larger cycles and rhythms within our bioregional location there? So
Mhm.
there's a seed of curiosity that drops in there, a depth of inquiry that can lead to more of this active participation rather than just the passive observation or being a bystander, somewhat disconnected, or a couple of layers actually removed from the natural world. And then, of course, there are actual skills that can help us to deepen that level of inquiry and develop real hands-on tangible skills
Oh
and
man.
shift into a wild state of awareness rather than more of this. I don't know if I want to say colonized, but domesticated maybe is a better word. Domesticated state of awareness. So there's a lot to
I
say
love all
there.
that. Yeah, no, I love all that, man. There's lots coming up for me in my mind. I'm thinking how many of us engage with nature, even putting the barrier of a phone up, like looking through the lens of a phone when I'm walking, like videoing and getting stuff ready for Instagram. I mean, this is all part of it, right? This is kind of where we are right now. And I'd come back and go, oh, I connected with nature today, but I even had like a screen preventing me from being there, and seeing it, you may as well sit at home and watch it on TV. And then of course, even taking it to the next level, which I know you
Mm,
do on your pilgrimages, is, I had this idea of kind of even building a fire.
mm.
And then I get out my lighter at the end, and I've probably burnt some man-made materials to kind of get it going, and versus friction,
Mm.
and the difference. I mean, the discipline and everything else that comes up around those two experiences, I think, just sums up what you're talking about perfectly.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot to be said about the wilderness survival piece. You can even say ancestral reconnection piece, because often those two are linked, and it also ties into shamanic philosophy and the animistic worldview piece of connecting to nature, like working with the elements, building and sleeping in shelters, or creating fire, like primitive friction fire with your bare hands, as you spoke to, learning what native bush foods are in our area and actually not just learning about them, but harvesting them, eating them on a regular basis. There's like, if we were out in the wild, how are we going to filter and purify our water? There's weaving baskets using natural fibers or carving our own eating utensils. And then, of course, there's the whole ceremonial processes and processions, the practices to honor and revere, give thanks to, give back to Earth, to really keep building a relationship with nature, with spirit, with the mystery. So,
Mm.
getting into that side of kind of nature awareness skills and bushcraft skills, wilderness survival, I've found it within myself. There has certainly been a reawakening of this. You could call it like an ancient earth-based gnosis, if you want to, that can happen when we choose to deepen our intimacy with the natural world through these certain skills and activities.
Yeah, I love that, man. And you don't have to get on an airplane and go somewhere across the other side of the planet in order to do this either. I'm thinking that it starts at home. It really starts at home. I'm thinking of
Mhm.
like the poet Gary Snyder. He said, "Get famous in a 5 mile radius of your house." And
Yeah.
and what he's talking about there is, do you know what's growing? The birds and the animals and the plants and within 5 miles of your home, and that's
Mm.
that's that's where you are. So, and I love that idea of getting famous, and that the birds know who you are when you come, you know, etc. And I think
Mm.
that's to me that speaks volumes.
Yeah. Well, I've there's a story that I could tell there, but unless you want to kind of put your hand
No,
on the rudder
please
and steer it a
tell,
different
you know,
direction.
as if I'm going to steer away from a storytelling.
Well, I mean, we're touching on so many ideas here, and I feel like one of them is the importance of showing up with a commitment, a discipline, a dedication to actually sincerely want to deepen our intimacy with the natural world. Because not everyone will want to do that. It does. It takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of effort over the seasons. I mean, one of the most basic practices, which I teach others in the wilderness immersion programs, which really is, to use this word I've used a couple of times, a springboard into a lot of other nature awareness skills or wild states of awareness. It's quite simply a sit spot. You could call it an earth meditation. There's lots of different ways that you can articulate it and contextualize it. But really, a sit spot, I talk about it in terms of being a teacher. It's quite simply a place to sit in nature and learn through observation. But it's not just once, it's daily or as many times as you can throughout the course of an entire cycle of the seasons or multiple times throughout the seasons. Because otherwise, how do we really get to know what's around us? Because there's just so many distractions around. But the story of the sit spot, I mean, I first started, and I often tell this story in my programs. The first time that I started a regular sit spot, it was hard to say, maybe 5 years ago. So not that long ago, really. And it's when we were south of Garryword, the Grampians. We're on a small acreage. It was a house on stilts. We had a permaculture garden with all the things, chickens and ducks and goats, but there wasn't much shade on the property. There weren't a lot of big mature trees. So a lot of the strong winds would come through. But one of the places where I found a little bit of respite and a little bit of a place where I could feel more deeply connected to the land on which we were living. Well, it was a blessing to live right beside a creek. So after a few months of living on this property, I started sit spotting by the creek. And from memory, I started at the start of autumn and went all the way through until midway through spring. And there were lots of little songbirds that I remember flitting about. I remember the huge oak tree stand right beside like a little bend in the creek. And I would go down there sometimes wearing a different colored piece of clothing. And this speaks into this idea of becoming famous for 5 miles and allowing nature to also get to know you. So I would mainly go down there in my kind of navy blue puffer jacket, but sometimes I would wear a different jacket or a different jumper. And I would notice after many, many weeks and months of going there, the birds would respond differently to me when I wore a different color clothing. And, I could talk about this idea of nature as a mirror here too, because I started spending a lot of time up in the Grampians and nature would reflect back qualities to me that I could feel within myself. The mountain face that was stoic against the elements, or the craggy, windswept trees, or the dead patch of branches lumped in a heap. There were lots of things that nature was mirroring back to me, and nature is a teacher into and unto myself. But down by the creek, I began to see and caught an unlikely friend. And this unlikely friend was a platypus. And, lots of people might go their entire lives hoping to see one platypus or two platypus. Sometimes people might go their whole lives not seeing a platypus. But over that autumn, winter, spring, we developed a companionship. And I used to see this particular platypus anywhere from 4 to 5 times a week. And there were lots of platypus in the creek, but it was this one little stretch of the creek that with this one particular platypus where we really started to develop what seemed like quite an intimate relationship. And it was a very reflective and quiet, kind of nostalgic time for me in my life. And I was longing for a lot more depth and richness and bringing a lot more poetry into my life. And it really felt like I was kind of living parallel to one of my favorite, you could call it a children's book, which is Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's book, the Little Prince, and his relationship to the fox. Because after those weeks and months passed, the platypus would come closer to the edge of the banks of the creek and do circles on top for, it's hard to say, maybe 30 seconds, 45 seconds, maybe a minute, absolute tops, which is not a huge length of time in the grand scheme of things. But it was the fact that we got closer to each other and we would stare at each other and we would look at each other just with this curiosity. And I mean, the that's one part of the story. The next, for those who haven't read it, I would recommend going and reading the book, The Little Prince, because it's great. But essentially, on that, the story of the Little Prince and the fox teaches the Little Prince about how to approach him and essentially how to do a sit spot. I don't think that was Anton de Saint-Exupéry's kind of intention, but it really does illuminate, like, it gives it this kind of this mythic or this poetic kind of way of how we can approach nature and how we can approach all the beings in nature, not just from this passive kind of observatory, kind of boring state, like that's a tree, that's a plant, but really to deepen these kind of poetic connections with
Oh
the
man,
spirits and the beings in nature.
that is wonderful. You oh man, thank you so much. You just brought up a lot of imagery for me. I've actually got a copy of The Little Prince, which I've had most of my life. It's all tattered and torn, but I've had it since I was a child.
Mm.
And I love that idea of the fox. I think it in the English translation, it's the fox kind of teaches him how the word they use is taming,
Yes.
but I don't think that that's actually the way that we would describe the word taming. It's a different idea because the fox remains wild.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I think they're using tame in a context that I love, but I can't quite define.
I have something specific that I say to that when I tell because I often tell the story of the Little Prince too, because it adds so much kind of flavor and texture and richness to it. And yeah, so the prince asks the fox to play, but the fox says that he can't yet play for he has not yet been tamed. But I wonder if what was really meant, and this is the way that I love to see it, was that the fox was actually saying he had not yet been courted, he had not yet been befriended, like shimmering stars to a water's edge or morning dew to a delicate flower.
I
So,
love
and I
that,
mean,
man. That is
man,
that's
that's
exactly
it.
it.
That's
That's
it.
exactly it. It's
Yeah.
courting. That's exactly it. It's I'm immediately reminded of courting the wild twin,
Hmm.
it's this idea that we have to dance into the relationship. You can't just kind of sling a rope around its neck and drag it back.
Yeah.
Or break it in, so to speak. It's a dance. It involves
Mm.
music and poetry and movement and breath and all the other things. There's, all that beautiful stuff. That's wonderful, man. Thank you for
Yeah.
thank you for bringing
Ah,
that in.
yeah, it's a pleasure. I mean, it's one of my favorite stories. I've told it so many times. And I kind of, it's worked its way through me in a way that's kind of a little bit different and that uses a little bit different from the classic book. But what I feel like the fox is really trying to communicate to the prince and vice versa. I mean, the way that the fox really speaks to the prince, it evokes, it's so evocative. It brings up so much imagery. Like the way I often tell it.
Foxwoman dreaming, man. It's foxwoman dreaming is what it is.
I mean,
Um,
yeah, it ties in so many threads here, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does, man. And again, I just harking back to what you were saying at the beginning of that little riff, this idea that there's a moment in time, and I'm thinking about you and the platypus and your sit spot um, where the relationship changes, and rather than you being curious of nature, nature becomes curious of you.
Yes.
And I think you only get that from stillness,
Mm,
and a sit spot like that. I'm reminded, I'm the same. Like there's a beautiful, beautiful hoop tree. It's enormous down at the back of my place, and
mm,
it too is near a creek, and that like I was just arrested by that spot, and it became a sit spot for me. But
mm,
there's another one, man, and I'm going to I just going to name this as well because it's so present for me after your story. But I spent a summer at a different sit spot years before that, and it was actually on a beach. I'd sort of found a little spot which just called to me, and over the course of a summer, I befriended a little pied oyster catcher,
mm,
and this bird would just come to me every time. Sometimes I wouldn't even realize because I'd be sitting there with my eyes closed, but when I opened my eyes, there he was. And the interesting thing about this bird was he was injured. Like one of his
mm,
one of his legs and foot was quite injured. And it just struck me as Of course, of course. Like there was just a really strong message in there for me, and that friendship, which kind of grew over the course of that summer, is something I'll never forget.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, there's certainly something to be said there about not only our connection with wildlife, but their connection with us. And, to kind of wrap a little bow on the story, I love what the fox says to the prince. Like you're talking about this idea of you befriending the bird, but the bird befriending yourself as well. So the fox says something to the degree of, if you befriend me, it'll be as if the sun came to shine on my life. I shall know the sound of a step different from all the others. He says, other steps, they send me scurrying back under the ground, but yours will call me like music out of my burrow. And he goes, you see the grain fields down yonder? I don't eat bread, so I don't have any use for the wheat. And sadly, those fields, well, they haven't had anything to say to me. But your hair is the color of gold, and think how wonderful that might be when you have befriended me. Those golden grain fields will carry your spirit, and I shall love to listen to the sound of the wheat, caressed by those morning winds. And it's then that the fox informs the prince how to court him, how to befriend him. He says, you got to be patient. First, you'll sit down at a little distance from me, and I'll look at you from the corner of my eye, and you'll say nothing, but you'll sit a little closer to me every day, coming back at the same hour. And then he says, for if you come at any other time, I'll never get to know what hour my heart is ready to greet you. So there's something to be said there about, showing up at a similar time, but also exploring what the seasons of the days and the nights have to say to us. But every single day, the prince came to visit the fox, and they became great friends. But the classic, all good things must come to an end. The time eventually came for the prince to leave, and the pain of saying goodbye was too much and made the fox cry. And the prince wondered during the fox's crying if there was actually any point to their friendship, exclaiming it had done the fox no good, no good at all, because now you're crying. And the fox replies, it has done me a world of good because of the color of the wheat fields. It's
Oh
just
man,
so
yeah,
beautiful.
I know there's so much in there, isn't there?
Yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah,
incredible.
yeah. So sit spots.
Yeah.
I mean, something basic that is accessible to all of us, no matter where we are, to help us deepen this active participation, this intimacy with the natural world.
And the discipline that's required around that, I think, is such an
Mm.
important piece to speak to because, whether it's hot, cold, wet, dry, you just show up.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
actually seeing it in all those different states is actually where the magic is.
yeah, yep,
Um, you know,
absolutely.
yeah. So look, I think this is beautiful, man. And so this idea of courting nature, like how do we do that? And again, we kind of brought in Martin Shaw there talking about, Foxwoman dreaming and
Mm,
some other ideas. He talks about 12 secret names as well, which I think is a
mm,
beautiful, easy um, very accessible way of beginning that journey to actually, take a walk in that 5 mile radius around your home and actually fall in love with something, and whether it's a tree or a flower or a rock,
mm,
and um, give that beloved 12 secret names, like you would your intimate partner,
hmm
um, and write to it and actually court it as you would a human,
hmm
in the way that we know. And it's exactly the same process. And I love this idea of 12 secret names, and
mm,
it takes you back to that place. And then you're singing
mm.
poetry to it.
We must be
Tell it
tapping
those
into the
12
same.
secret names too, Kai. Tell it. Don't just go home and write them down on a piece of paper.
Oh,
Like
that's
go and
right. Yeah,
sing it back to it.
yeah, speak them aloud. Yeah, we're
Mm.
tapping into the same thread of consciousness here because I was voraciously reading and watching a lot of Dr. Martin Shaw's videos at that time. And it was during that time of living at that property and going down to the creek that I first watched his video where he spoke to that, the idea of 12 secret names.
There you go.
Yeah.
It's wonderful stuff, man. And I guess just to take us on a slightly different tangent. Yeah,
Mm,
we're talking again. We're kind of talking about this idea of bridging worlds. And I noticed that you are quite interested in speaking to the difference between an initiatory experience and a rite of
Mm.
passage, which, this bridging kind of is. And I wonder, if you could say something around that.
I could say a lot about that. Yeah. Okay, so I'm returning to that triangle that we kind of elucidated, the nature awareness skills, shamanism, animism, spirituality, mysticism. So they're all complementary to each other. And I often say that shamanic or spiritual states of awareness are often better facilitated through the cultivation of nature awareness skills. And then why is that? Well, I would say that nature awareness skills, just like all these other states of consciousness, they really require the cultivation of being a hollow bone. And there's many different ways that you could language this. A hollow bone, an empty vessel, a clear chalice. It's a state of consciousness, a state of being, and a fundamental principle of shamanism and spirituality that allows spirit to really flow through us in, you could say, a pure way. There's many other different ways to describe it. And, in the context of my work, when we're talking about shamanism, which can also find a link between rites of passage and initiatory experiences. I mean, a lot of people think that shamanism may be relegated to the idea of, let's say, plant medicines or psychoactive compounds, but that's only one thread. The philosophy and practice of shamanism is pan-cultural, cross-cultural. It's much more expansive than that. And some people might consider themselves to be purists and say that, well, shamanism only really can be found in one pocket of earth. And because shamanism, the word itself, has been extracted from the Tungusic languages of Siberia and applied as a blanket term on many cultural practices and philosophies. But I say that the roots take hold in similar soil, which is, we spoke to before, revelation through direct experience with nature spirit. It's mastering energy, the cultivation of personal power, a deep connection with the patterns, the rhythms, the seasons of our local ecology, the bridging worlds between this world and the other. It's these repeatable techniques for altering and expanding awareness, communion with spirit beings, totem allies, deities, elementals, all kinds of extrasensory psychic phenomena. There's the ceremonial and ritualistic practices, healing, honoring the sacred, serving community, this overarching normality of animistic consciousness, but also, as you speak to, this idea of initiatory experiences, or some people say rites of passage, but I was kind of offering a bit of pretext to kind of tie it all in together there. But I like to make a distinction between the two because the two phrases often get lumped together. And I think it's a good thing if we can kind of tease them apart a little bit and offer a little bit more nuance and context there. So, when I first actually came across these ideas, I believe it was through Martin Shaw, speaking to them and then feeling into them through my own personal experience and leaning on some of the giants of our time, such as Bill Plotkin. Michael Mead might even speak to this to some degree. But I often say that passage rites are, let's call them deliberate, culturally sanctioned rituals or processes that often serve to acknowledge or mark or honor a transition from one life stage to another. So it could be from adolescence to adulthood, boyhood to manhood, becoming an adult into becoming an elder, many other iterations and life transitions. And a passage rite, in a traditional sense, typically has some kind of physical, psycho-emotional, spiritual risk involved. And you could categorize it by three major stages: the severance, the threshold, the actual experience itself, and then the return. No, you could say the preparatory phase, the main process itself, and then integration. And then a key part, I would say, of a rite of passage, upon return, it's being welcomed back by community, which offers a sense of belonging, connection, and being witnessed and acknowledged as having a new role, a new identity within the wider community. And in the word passage, as Martin Shaw might suggest, it denotes a start, there's a passage to pass through, and an end. While initiation, on the other hand, it's a lot more nebulous, initiate to start. There's not necessarily a formal ending. So I say that initiatory experiences, they can be crafted intentionally, but they can also be spontaneous and unexpected. I mean, they can be catalyzed by a vast array of factors: illness, sudden death, grief, a profound moment of connection with nature, or a mystical encounter with the divine. So we're being initiated into something new. And again, Martin Shaw waxes lyrical that when we first start off down this path, we may think we have an idea of what the journey is actually all about, but it's not until we're well down the track and we turned around and we look back toward the trailhead that we might go, okay, now I'm actually starting to get more of a sense of what I'm being initiated into. So really, to kind of sum that all up, a rite of passage, that can be an initiatory experience, but an initiatory experience, it's not necessarily a rite of passage. So they're similar. They both have the opportunity to be transformed, but yeah, they have different qualities and characteristics to them.
Oh man,
That's
I
the way
think
that I
you
typically articulate it.
yeah, I think you've done that really well, and that's my sense also.
Mm,
Yeah, deeply felt,
mm,
deeply
mm,
felt in that, the initiation, it may not be something that you've called in.
mm,
And I can think of many times in my life, they're initiations. I've had rites of passages as well, but they're
mm,
more, they're more structured, and understood ahead of time. Whereas initiation
mm,
and what's really interesting to me too, brother, which I feel like I must name is that the word passage is very connected to the word fear, which comes
really?
from,
Oh, say more.
yeah, well, fear comes from the word thoroughfare,
Thoroughfare. Okay.
which is also a passage.
Hmm.
So I think about in the overarching discussion around all this, we have to call in the notion of fear, which is almost a necessary ingredient.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, there's people use these terms in many different ways, and I don't know if there's any kind of authority on what it is, but I think this is a good way to try and provide context between the differences of the two.
Yeah, no, I think that's great, man. That's great.
Yeah.
And I think again, and I've spoken to this a few times in this discussion, but whether in an initiation or a rite of passage or in any kind of bridge, to me, it comes back to discipline.
Mm.
And what I'd like to kind of mention here, kind of in a more public forum, is how much I admire the discipline that you bring into your work. Like I've sat with you many times in sacred circles and through different modalities and different experiences, and what always comes up for me is just how well disciplined you are. Like you walk the walk, you practice what you preach, and the energy that you exude in those spaces is just incredible. And I know that it comes from discipline, just in terms of the quality of the space holding.
Yeah, thanks, mate. I appreciate that. And it also comes from getting a lot of backlash, and not necessarily from other people, but I say from spirit, from creator, when I have fallen deeply out of integrity, being, being in the captain's seat, so to speak, with a lot of what I have to offer community in this regard. If I do find myself out of integrity in a deep way, or I'm not keeping up with my practices or my commitment to this path, then yeah, I know about it very
Mm.
quickly. I mean, I'm informed on a very kind of somatic level.
Yeah, well, that's interesting to hear, but it certainly comes across. And I love sitting in spaces with you, brother. And I hope I get the chance again very soon. And speaking to that, I know that you have a pilgrimage coming up around my neck of the woods up here
Mm,
in the Northern Rivers. Do you want to speak to that in terms of what's called you to that, and anything
mm.
else around that, really?
Yes, the pilgrimage. Shamanic wilderness expeditions. It's really the next iteration of the work that I've been doing and that has been evolving over the past decade, really. And it's really, well, it is this convergence of all of these themes that we've been speaking to: nature awareness, the wilderness immersion, the mountain trekking, shamanic practice and philosophy, spirituality, mysticism, all these kinds of things. And I use this catchphrase a lot when it comes to this body of work, which is exploring the mysteries, awakening more of our potential, reclaiming more of our power, and activating more of our medicine. I feel like this is what this program has been designed to do, to really allow us to come into more of a deeper connection, not with just the outside world and, in that context, the natural world, the wild, but also to get us in touch with more of our truth, more of our inner authority, more of our personal rightness, our personal power, more of what you might call our soul. And that's a whole nother conversation right there, mate. The idea of soul, and I often find resonance with the way that Bill Plotkin talks about soul in terms of our unique blueprint, our original instructions of what we're here to, of who we're here to be, what we're here to do, and what we're here to do. I often say that that's secondary to who we are to be, taking notes from Eckhart Tolle. Primary purpose is being, secondary purpose is doing. But who we're meant to be within the context of the larger ecological niche. It's how we, our unique framework, our unique blueprint, our unique divine blueprint, yeah, operates within the larger natural ecological field. But essentially, the program, it's designed as a pathway into the mysteries of nature and spirit to help activate and amplify, this connection to a higher potential, creative expression, truth, all these things that I spoke to. So it's also been designed to move around. I mean, that is the very nature of a pilgrimage, a spiritual voyage or a spiritual journey to different sacred sites. And we've had a couple down here in Victoria. We just finished up one in the Victorian High Country, and our one prior to that was over in Garryword, the Grampians. And for the most part, it's a 4 day, 3 day, 4 night. Sorry, let me start that again. It's a 4 day, 3 night journey, a shamanic wilderness expedition. And the one up in the hinterlands, we're going to be anchoring ourselves at a rainforest sanctuary just within Wilson's Creek there on Bundjalung country. And for those who are participating, well, they'll be curated through a journey of these nature awareness skills, shamanic practices and processions, wilderness trekking up through the mountains, and to be sure, a lot more than that.
Mm, absolutely, man. And we've spoken kind of loosely around kind of weaving myself into that in some way, and kind of whatever comes, whatever unfolds with regards to the fifth direction community as well. So making no fixed plans for that, but let's just see how it all comes together. But that's in. Can you give me the dates for that again?
Yeah, I can. It is the 18th to the 21st of July.
Perfect. So actually, not too far away.
It's 6 weeks away.
Yeah. So you know, I'll put in the notes where to find Kai and how to get involved with that. But if anything in
Mm.
this conversation has kind of resonated with you and you're thinking that that might be a good thing, and it's men and women, so we're not talking about. I know we've kind of talked a little about men's work here, but this
Mm.
is open to everybody, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Mm,
Mm.
yeah. Well, look,
Yes, on the first journey that we had over in the Grampians, it was more skewed towards women, and then this immediate journey that we just had up in the Victorian High Country that